Joanna Bergman reached her apartment after an exhausting night shift. Already in the hallway, there was a strong smell of fried onions and something sweet. Her mother-in-law, Ellen Ryder, was standing in the kitchen, wearing a colorful apron and stirring a pot on the stove. The shift had been brutal. 12 hours on her feet, 3 difficult patients. One of them almost had to be moved to the intensive care unit. Her head throbbed with fatigue and her legs ached. Joanna, whom everyone called Jo, wanted only one thing: to sink onto the sofa, take off those damn shoes, and close her eyes, even if only for an hour. But something was wrong. Jo stood frozen on the threshold. It took a moment for her to realize exactly what had changed. The armchair was against a different wall. The coffee table had been moved to the window. The floor lamp that always stood in the corner was now leaning against the bookshelf. Even the rug had been rotated 90 degrees. Someone had moved things in her absence. On the kitchen table lay a note written in large, looping script. "I did a little rearranging. It's much cozier this way. Please don't thank me, Ellen." Jo slowly crumpled the note in her fist. Her jaw tightened with a world of unsaid words. She had bought this one-bedroom apartment in a good Seattle neighborhood 5 years ago. She had saved for it since she was young, sacrificing everything. She worked double shifts and extra hours at private clinics on the weekends. Every cent went into her savings. When she finally held the keys in her hands, it was the best day of her life. 3 years ago, she married Mark Ryder. He moved in with her. Mark was a quiet, conflict-averse man who worked as a clerk in a trading company. His salary was average, but Jo didn't care. She earned well, especially from her night shifts and overtime. She didn't need a provider, just someone normal by her side to share daily life with, and maybe have children one day. It seemed that way at first, at least for the first 6 months. Then Ellen, her mother-in-law, appeared in her life. At first, she came rarely, once a month for coffee, bringing a jar of homemade jam or a pack of cookies. She was polite, but Jo felt a tension in her gaze. Ellen scanned the apartment as if calculating what she could move, throw away, or add. Over time, the visits became more frequent every 2 weeks, then every week. Finally, she started showing up when Jo wasn't home. And now, the furniture rearrangement. Jo threw the note into the trash, took off her jacket, and went into the bedroom. Mark was still sleeping in a t-shirt and boxers, stretched across the bed. He worked until 4:30 p.m. and then stayed in front of the computer until midnight playing strategy games. She lay down next to him without changing and closed her eyes. She couldn't sleep. Thoughts raced through her head. How had his mother gotten in with a key she wasn't supposed to have, only to rearrange furniture in someone else's apartment? A few hours later, Mark woke up, stretched, and sleepily kissed his wife on the shoulder. "How was the shift?" "Good," Jo said, sitting up in bed. She looked at him. "Mark, where did your mother get the keys to the apartment?" He blinked, not understanding immediately. "Which keys?" "The ones to this apartment. She was here while I was gone and moved all the furniture in the living room." Mark scratched the back of his head and smiled sheepishly. "Oh, I gave her a spare key. Just in case." "Just in case? In case of what?" "Well, in case something happens to us and we're not home, or in case you lose your keys." Jo looked at him in silence. He turned his gaze away. "She's just worried about us. She just wants to help. Helping is when you bring groceries or clean when you're asked, not when you commit criminal trespassing by entering the apartment without the owner's permission and moving the furniture." "Owner," Mark repeated, his voice tinged with offense. "I live here too, by the way." "Yes, you live here, but I own the apartment." He pursed his lips, stood up, and pulled on his jeans. "You always remind me of that. I only remind you of it when your mother oversteps boundaries. She just wanted to do something nice. Something nice is asking if we need help, not breaking in here when I'm gone and rearranging the furniture to her own taste." Mark paced nervously around the room. "Fine. I'll tell her not to do it anymore and take the keys from her." "Jo, why?" "She's my mother, not a stranger." "The keys, Mark." He sighed and nodded. "All right, I'll take them back." But he didn't take the keys from her. 2 weeks passed. Jo intentionally didn't bring up the subject, but simply observed. Ellen now appeared twice a week, each time in her daughter-in-law's absence. Mark commented on it casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. "My mother was here. She brought meatloaf. My mother was here. She cleaned the windows. My mother left a pot of soup." Jo said nothing. She just took note. Ellen was claiming territory, gaining ground inch by inch. A strange shampoo appeared in the bathroom. New pot holders were in the kitchen. In the hallway stood size 10 slippers that clearly didn't belong to Mark. And then, something happened that finally alarmed Jo. She came home from a night shift one Wednesday morning, so exhausted her hands were shaking. In the hospital, a 47-year-old man had died of a heart attack. They had tried to resuscitate him, but they hadn't succeeded. Cases like this always hit Jo hard, even though she tried not to show it. She changed in the staff room, got a coffee from the machine, and sat in a quiet corner to collect herself before going home. Heike, an older registered nurse who had worked at the hospital for 35 years, sat down next to her. She was an experienced, direct woman who saw right through people. "How are you doing?" she asked, pouring tea from a thermos. "Good, it was a hard night. It happens." Heike was silent for a moment, then said casually, "I heard your mother-in-law is very active." Jo tensed up. "How do you know that?" "One of our assistants lives in your neighborhood. She says she saw your mother-in-law in the hallway. She had the apartment keys and was bragging to her neighbor about what a nice apartment her son and daughter-in-law have." "So what?" Jo asked coldly. Heike looked at her seriously. "She also said that her daughter Katie, I think, is looking for an apartment right now. Rents have become expensive. The landlord raised the price. She has 2 small children. Her husband's paycheck is irregular. Ellen has been complaining to everyone that she wants to help, but she only has a small apartment herself." Jo froze. "Heike, what are you getting at?" "I'm saying you should keep your property documents locked away. Anything can happen. People get inventive when they need a place to stay." Jo thanked her and drove home, but her colleague's words stuck like a thorn. She vaguely remembered Katie. She had seen her a few times at family gatherings, a woman in her 40s, a dyed blonde with a perpetually dissatisfied face. She worked as a sales clerk, and her husband worked as a warehouse laborer. They had 2 preschool-aged children. When she got home, Jo immediately checked her documents. They were in the safe she kept in her locker at work. Property deed, records, sales, contract, everything was in its place. Mark had never been interested in where she kept the papers, and he didn't have a key to the safe. Relieved, Jo went home and lay down to sleep. The next few days were quiet. Ellen didn't show up. Mark behaved as usual. He worked, came home, ate dinner, played on the computer. Jo almost believed it was all over. But one evening, while she was washing the dishes after dinner, Mark's phone rang in the hallway. He went into the bathroom and left his smartphone on the sofa. Jo didn't intend to listen, but Ellen's voice over the speaker was so loud that it was impossible not to hear. "Don't worry, everything will work out. The apartment is going to be available." "I'm telling you." Jo froze, plate in hand. She dried her palms, went into the living room, and picked up the phone. "Ellen? Good evening." There was a pause. "Oh, Jo. Hi. I'm just talking to Mark. I heard which apartment is becoming available." "What are you talking about? You told your daughter the apartment is going to be available." Ellen snorted. "I wasn't talking about your apartment. I just want to have some renovations done. I'm discussing it with Katie right now. Maybe she can help with that. You only have a small apartment anyway. And so what? I can call it whatever I want." Jo didn't argue. She just hung up the phone in silence. Mark came out of the bathroom, picked up his smartphone, saw that the call had ended, and looked at his wife guiltily. "Mom called." "Yeah, what did she want?" "Ask her yourself." He didn't. And Jo finally understood. Something was brewing. Ellen was spinning a web, and Mark knew about it, or worse, he was involved. The next day, Jo got up early, got dressed, and went out. She returned an hour later with a locksmith. He quickly removed the old locks from the front door and installed new, reliable ones with protection against break-ins and drilling. 3 sets of keys. One for Jo, a spare in the safe at work, and the third for Mark. When her husband came home from work that evening, he didn't realize at first what had happened. He tried to open the door with his old key, but it didn't work. He rang the bell. Jo opened the door and handed him the new set of keys. "I changed the locks." Mark's face twisted. "Why?" "Because your mother had a spare key that you promised to take back from her 2 weeks ago." "I forgot. It doesn't matter now." "But Mom, if something happens, she'll call us, like any normal person." Mark's face turned red. He went into the room and threw his bag on the bed. "You could have at least let me know. Let you know so you could have a third spare maid?" She turned around, her eyes flashing with indignation. "I don't understand what's going on here. She's my mother, not a stranger. This is my apartment, and I decide who has the keys." "Oh, your apartment. And I'm just living here temporarily, right?" "Yes." Jo rubbed her face tiredly. "Mark, that's enough. You know exactly what I mean." "I know," he laughed bitterly, "that you bought it before the wedding, that I'm nobody here." "I didn't say that." "But you're thinking it. They had their first serious argument in 3 years. Mark shouted that she was cold-hearted, that family meant nothing to her, and that she was obsessed with control. Joe stayed silent because she knew every word was useless. He only saw his own truth and his mother's. That evening, they formally reconciled. Mark apologized. Joe nodded. He hugged her. She didn't pull away. But something between them was broken for good. 3 days later, there was a letter in the mailbox. Joe got the mail as usual. Flyers, utility bills, the local paper, and an envelope with the logo of a law firm. She opened it immediately in the hallway. Inside was a request to confirm a power of attorney for a transfer without consideration, specifically a gift of half the property ownership at 8 Lark Lane, apartment 53, to Katie Ryder. Joe read the letter twice, then picked up the phone and dialed the number on the letterhead. Schneider Law Firm. Good afternoon. Hello. My name is Joanna Bergman. I've seen a request to confirm a power of attorney for the gifting of an apartment. I never signed any such power of attorney. The young woman on the phone hesitated. One moment, let me check. There was the sound of paper rustling and a keyboard clicking. Yes, in fact, we have such an application. And Ellen Ryder submitted a power of attorney in your name to handle the gift transfer. I repeat, I have not signed any notarized power of attorney. Is that clear? In that case, the proceedings will be suspended until the circumstances are clarified. You must come in person with your state ID or driver's license and provide a statement. Joe promised to come the next day and hung up. Her hands were shaking. Ellen had tried to carry out a gift transfer using forged documents. She had forged Joe's signature, gone to the law firm with a fake power of attorney, and tried to transfer half the apartment to her daughter. This wasn't just overstepping. This was attempted fraud. Joe went upstairs, locked the door with all the locks, and sat in the kitchen, staring out the window. Her head was spinning. What should she do? Call the police? Speak directly to Ellen? Tell Mark? No, Mark wouldn't believe it, or he'd believe it but try to justify his mother. He'd say she just wanted to help her daughter, that she made a mistake, that she didn't mean any harm. Joe decided on a different path. Tomorrow she would go to the law firm, make the attempt official, and explain that the power of attorney was forged. And after that, she would wait. Ellen would hardly hold back after this attempt. She would try again, more cunningly, more cleverly. And Joe had to be prepared for it. The next day, she drove to the law firm and filed a statement. The notary, an older woman with a sharp gaze, listened intently and shook her head. Unfortunately, this happens often. Relatives try to seize property by taking advantage of the owner's trust or naivety. It's good that you reacted in time. And what happens to the person who submitted the forged power of attorney? Can I file a police report? Forgery of documents is a criminal offense. Joe thought about it and declined. I won't do that for now. Just block everything related to this apartment. No transactions without me being present. Sensible, the notary nodded. When she got home, Joe felt an emptiness. Ellen had crossed a line. Now it was an undeclared war. But it was a war, and Joe intended to win it. At home, she found Mark in front of the computer. He was playing another strategy game, clicking enthusiastically. He didn't even turn around when his wife came in. Mark, we need to talk. Uh-huh. Just a second, I'm finishing this round. Joe pulled the plug from the outlet. The screen went black. What are you doing? We need to talk now. He leaned back in his chair, sulking. What is it now? Your mother tried to use a forged power of attorney in my name to give half the apartment to your sister. He blinked. What? You misheard. That must be a mistake. It's not a mistake. I was at the law firm today. Everything was confirmed. He shook his head. That can't be. Mom wouldn't do something like that. She did it, and she tried. Maybe she just got confused. Joe laughed bitterly. Confused? She forged my signature, went to a law firm with fake papers, and tried to transfer my apartment to her daughter. And you call that confused? Mark stood up and paced nervously around the room. I'll talk to her. That's not necessary. What do you mean, not necessary? It's not necessary. I want to see what she does next. Joe, are you serious? Absolutely. Your mother has shown what she's capable of. Now I'm going to be ready for whatever she does next. You're turning this into some kind of surveillance. I'm protecting my property. Mark clenched his fists. I see. To you, property is more important than family. My family is you and me, not your mother, not your sister. Us. They're part of my family too. Then choose. Silence fell. Mark looked at his wife in disbelief. You're giving me a choice? No. You put yourself in this position when you gave your mother the keys without my knowledge, when you allowed her to feel at home in my apartment, when you closed your eyes to her overstepping. And now she's tried to forge documents. Mark remained silent, then turned abruptly and left the room. The bedroom door slammed shut. Jo was left alone in the kitchen. She sat down and rested her hands on the table. Inside, she felt empty and cold. She understood that what was coming now could only get worse. Ellen wouldn't give up, and neither would Katie. They would push, manipulate, and come up with new plans. And Mark wouldn't be able to hold out against them. He was too weak, too dependent on his mother. Sooner or later, all of this would end in an explosion. Jo didn't know exactly when it would happen, but she felt it would be very soon. The following weeks passed in a tense silence. Mark barely spoke to her. He would come home from work, eat dinner alone, and retreat to his room. Ellen didn't show up anymore. Apparently, Mark had said something to her, but Jo knew this was just the calm before the storm. The enemy was retreating to regroup and strike back with even greater force. And she was ready to ward off that blow with everything she had, even though she didn't yet know how cruel it would be. 2 weeks had passed since the incident with the forged power of attorney. Jo worked her usual rhythm, 3 night shifts a week, 2-day shifts, weekends at home. Mark stayed quiet, almost staying out of sight. He came, went, ate, and slept. Their conversations were kept to a minimum. Bills, food, small household details, and then Mark suddenly changed. Jo came home from her shift on Saturday evening and found a large, beautiful bouquet of yellow chrysanthemums on the kitchen table. Beside it was a note. It said, "Forgive me for everything. I love you, Mark." Jo stared at the flowers for a long time. Something inside her tightened, like the air before a thunderstorm. Mark never gave flowers without a reason, only for birthdays or Christmas. And he definitely didn't apologize this way. Her husband came out of the bedroom, smiling but looking unsure of himself. "Do you like them?" "They're beautiful. Thank you. I thought maybe we should go out somewhere, to the movies or a restaurant." Jo looked at him in silence. Mark rubbed his hands together nervously. "We haven't been out alone in a long time. You work so much. You're tired. We should get some rest." "All right," she answered. They went to an Italian restaurant in downtown Seattle. Mark ordered wine, pasta, and dessert. He talked about his work and a new project he had been assigned. He was being charming and attentive. Jo nodded, ate, and gave one-word answers. She was waiting. The blow came 3 days later. Mark was sitting on the sofa with a cup of tea. Jo was folding the laundry. He cleared his throat as if gathering his courage. "Joanna, I've been thinking." She kept folding the towel without turning around. "Our one-bedroom apartment is pretty spacious, and it's just the two of us. And, well, I thought maybe we could rent a room to a student or a young professional. It would be a nice extra source of income." Jo put the towel in the closet, closed the door, and turned around. "No." Mark blinked. "Why such a flat no? Let's at least discuss it." "There is nothing to discuss. I don't want strangers in my apartment. But think about how much money that would be. I don't need that money. I need my home, where I can relax in peace after a shift." Mark put his cup on the table and stood up. "Joanna, you can't be so stubborn. People rent out rooms. It's normal. I'm not going to do it. And if I insist?" She looked him in the eye. "You can insist as much as you want. The apartment belongs to me. I make the decisions." Mark's face darkened. "There it is again. The apartment belongs to you. I'm nobody here, right?" "Exactly. You aren't an owner here, and you have no right to decide who lives in this space." He clenched his fists, turned around, and went into the bedroom. The door slammed shut. Jo went back to the kitchen and finished her water. A dark premonition spread through her. Mark hadn't come up with this idea on his own. Someone had clearly put him up to it, and it wasn't hard to guess who. A week later, the doorbell rang. It was Sunday morning. Jo opened the door and found Katie with her 2 children, a boy about 5 and a girl about 3, standing on the doorstep with jackets and backpacks on. "Hi, Jo. Can we come in?" Katie entered the apartment without waiting for an answer. The children followed her and immediately began exploring the rooms. "Is Mark home?" Jo asked. "He's still sleeping. Don't worry. We'll be very quiet." Katie sat down in the kitchen. The children ran into the living room. Jo stood in the hallway and watched. Katie took a thermos out of her bag and poured herself some tea. "You don't mind us just dropping by, do you? We were just walking in the park nearby, and I thought I'd stop by to see my brother." "Mark hasn't woken up yet." "Yeah, I'll wait." Jo went into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. Katie looked at her with a sort of pitying smile. "You know, Jo, I'm so embarrassed." "About what?" "Well, about the power of attorney. My mom told me about it. I didn't know anything, I swear. She came up with that all by herself. I only found out after the fact. I see. Forgive me if you want. I would never have agreed to something like that. Joe nodded without answering. Katie was silent for a moment, then sighed deeply. You know, we're in a bit of trouble right now. What kind of trouble? The landlord doubled the rent. Imagine that. We can't afford it. My husband's paycheck is irregular. They cut my hours at the shop. The kids are growing and they need so much. Daycare, clothes, food. Joe listened in silence. Katie stared into her cup. We thought about moving into something cheaper, but the conditions there are terrible. Mold on the walls, leaky windows. I can't take the kids there. And paying that much for an old studio apartment isn't an option either. I'm sorry to hear that, Joe said calmly. Katie looked up. You have so much space here. A one-bedroom apartment with a good layout, and it's just the two of you. Joe put the glass in the sink. Katie, if you've come here to ask us to let you move in, my answer is no. Katie turned red. That's not it. I just thought maybe we could come to an agreement temporarily, just for a few months. We would pay for utilities and food, and help out around the house, of course. No. But why? We're family. Exactly. Relatives should live separately so they don't ruin their relationships. Katie curled her lips. So you don't care that my children don't have decent living conditions? Your children have a mother and a father. You are adults. Solve your own problems. How heartless you are. Joe shrugged and left the kitchen. Mark was already awake. He came into the hallway in sweatpants and a t-shirt. When he saw his sister, he looked happy. Katie, what a surprise. We were just out with the kids. I wanted to talk to you. They went into the living room. Joe heard their voices. Katie was explaining something enthusiastically. Mark answered soothingly. Then they left. Katie gathered the children, dressed them, shot Joe a furious look, and left, slamming the door behind her. Mark stood in the hallway staring at the floor. Was it so hard for you to agree? For just a few months. She's family. Your family isn't mine. The children are small. They need proper conditions. Their parents should take care of that. That's their duty, not mine. Mark shook his head. I don't recognize you anymore. You've become so hard. I've become protective of my boundaries. There's a difference. He went into his room and slammed the door. Joe went back to the kitchen and drank the rest of her water. An uneasy feeling spread through her. First Mark with the suggestion to rent out a room, then Katie with the request to move in. It was no coincidence. It was a plan. Ellen was pushing from all sides, trying to find a crack in the defense. And worst of all, Mark was completely on her side. A few days later, the next stage of the siege began. Ellen showed up again. This time, she didn't have a spare key. She simply rang the bell while Joe was home. Hello, my dear daughter. I made some soup and brought it over for you. Joe let her in silently. Ellen went into the kitchen and put the pot on the stove. Is Mark home? He's at work. That's a shame. I wanted to talk to him. She looked around as if she were evaluating the territory. It's clean in here. Well done. A good housewife. Joe didn't answer. Ellen opened the fridge and looked inside. You're low on groceries. Let me go shopping for you. That's not necessary. What's it to you? I enjoy it. I'll do my own shopping when I need to. Ellen closed the fridge and turned to her daughter-in-law. The smile vanished from her face. You know, Joe, I wanted to talk to you like an adult. I'm listening. Do you understand that my daughter is in a difficult situation? 2 kids, a husband who barely makes anything. Rent is insane, and you have a whole room sitting empty here. The room isn't empty. We're planning to turn it into a nursery. Ellen snorted. A nursery? You've been married for 3 years and still no kids. Maybe it's time to stop planning. It's time to actually have them. Joe grit her teeth, forcing herself not to snap back. That's between me and Mark. Not you. Not mine? I'm the mother. I want grandkids. And you're always just focused on your career and money. The apartment is in your name. The papers are yours. But what about the family? Ellen, I'm tired. I need some peace before my shift. Would you please leave? Her mother-in-law didn't move. Did you know that by law, your husband is entitled to half of this apartment? Even if it's only in your name? Joe froze. Ellen smiled when she saw the reaction. You didn't know that? Well, it's true. Assets acquired during a marriage are split, and Mark can demand his share if he wants to. The apartment was bought before the wedding, sure, but you renovated it. You bought furniture and appliances. All of that counts as marital property, and it can be proven that the value of this place went up because of your husband's investments. Joe exhaled slowly. You want Mark to sue for his share. I want you to be fair. Mark is my son, he's your husband. He has the same rights you do. But you act like he's just a guest here, a visitor. It's my apartment for now. Yes, but the law can change that. Mark can demand what's rightfully his, and then half of this apartment belongs to him. He'll be the one deciding who lives here. Ellen grabbed her bag and walked to the door. On the threshold, she turned around. Think about what I said, Joe. Family isn't just about rights, it's about obligations. You have to help out, especially when your relatives ask for it. The door closed. Joe stood in the middle of the kitchen, clenching her fists so hard her nails dug into her palms. Ellen had openly threatened her, hinting that Mark could claim half the apartment, and knowing her husband's character, Joe knew he was capable of it. If his mother pushed him hard enough, he'd go to court. She had to act. The next day, Joe took a personal day and went to see a lawyer. She found one through a recommendation from her friend Lena. She was a family law specialist, a woman in her 50s with a sharp gaze and a direct way of speaking. After hearing the story, the lawyer nodded. The situation is unpleasant, but it's not critical. The apartment was purchased before the marriage, and that's well documented. Therefore, it's not considered marital property. And if my husband proves he contributed to the renovation, Joe asked, he can try, but he'll need receipts, invoices, and proof that he actually paid for the work or materials. Do you have those documents? Joe thought about it. I'm not sure. The renovation was 4 years ago, before the wedding. I bought most of the furniture, the appliances too. Look, if he can't prove a significant financial contribution, the court isn't going to grant him half the apartment. Your mother-in-law is just trying to scare you. It's a common tactic intimidation to get you to agree to their terms voluntarily. The lawyer picked up a notebook and started writing. Here's what I advise. Gather every document that proves the apartment was bought with your money. Bank statements, the property deed, the purchase contract, and all payment receipts. If you have proof that your husband made no financial contribution, collect that as well. Bills, receipts, correspondence, anything that supports your position. And honestly, if you feel like the situation is escalating, you might want to think about a power of attorney update, a post-nuptial agreement, or even a divorce. Because these things usually only get worse. Joe thanked her and left. Back at home, she pulled out her folder of records and started going through the papers. The purchase contract was in her name. The bank statement showed the loan was in her name. The payments had all come from her account. The renovation bills? Every single one was paid by her before the wedding. Mark hadn't actually invested a cent in the place. He had moved into a fully furnished one-bedroom apartment. All he had done was live there. Joe even paid the utilities because she earned more. She packed up the documents and hid them in the safe at her office. Now, if it ever went to court, she had protection. But Joe hoped it wouldn't come to that. Over the next few days, Ellen showed up every single day. Sometimes she brought soup, sometimes meatloaf, or she just stopped by to visit. Mark had clearly given her a set of keys, because Joe would often come home from work to find her mother-in-law already inside. I cleaned the windows, she'd say. They were filthy, and I mopped the floors. You're so tired after work, you don't have time to clean. Joe took these comments in silence, but inside, she was boiling. Ellen was marking her territory again, showing that she could come in whenever she wanted, and Mark was backing her up. One day, Joe found her mother-in-law in the bedroom. She was standing in front of the closet, looking through the shelves. "What are you doing in here?" Joe asked coldly. Ellen turned around without a hint of shame. "I'm just seeing how you organize your things. You could arrange this better, make some more room?" "For what?" Joe asked, her guard up. "Well, when someone else moves in, you're going to need the space." Joe stepped closer. "Ellen, no one is moving in. I already told you that." "We'll see about that," her mother-in-law said. She grabbed her bag and walked through the hallway to the door. "I'll be back tomorrow. I want to scrub the bathroom tiles." "That's not necessary." "Yes, it is. You don't have the time." Joe walked her to the door and locked every single bolt. She sat down on the sofa and buried her face in her hands. It was unbearable. Ellen was acting like the apartment belonged to her, and Mark wasn't lifting a finger to stop it. On the contrary, he was making it easy for her. That evening, Mark announced he was going on a business trip. 3 days in Portland to negotiate with suppliers. "Fine," Joe replied. She wasn't surprised. She had expected this. Mark was leaving, so he wouldn't have to deal with the fallout of whatever his mother was doing. That meant Ellen was planning something serious. Mark left on Monday morning. By that evening, the doorbell was already ringing. Ellen was on the doorstep with bags of groceries. "I decided to cook you something. It's so lonely being by yourself." Joe let her in. Her mother-in-law went straight to the kitchen, and started unpacking meat and vegetables, making a lot of noise and commenting on everything she did. Joe stayed in the living room, pretending to watch TV. Ellen left an hour later, saying she'd be back the next day. And she was. She came back the next day, and the day after that. Every time, she stayed for hours. She walked through the rooms, inspecting everything. She asked about Joe's work hours when she'd be home and when she wouldn't. Do you have any night shifts? Yes. How often? It depends on the schedule. Do you have any this week? Joe looked at her closely. Why do you want to know? Ellen just smiled. I'm just curious. It must be so hard working through the night. I've gotten used to it. Joe didn't tell her that she actually did have a night shift on Thursday. She let her mother-in-law believe she hadn't seen through the plan. On Wednesday, Mark came back from his trip. He was acting intentionally neutral and barely spoke. Joe noticed him typing away on his phone, hiding the screen whenever she walked by. On Thursday morning, Joe got ready for her shift. She changed, grabbed her bag, and headed out. But once she got to work, she told her supervisor she wasn't feeling well and asked if she could leave early. Her supervisor agreed without any questions. Joe left the hospital at 2 p.m. and drove home, but she didn't go inside. She stood by the entrance, hidden behind the corner of the building where she could see the door. She waited. 20 minutes later, an old red car pulled up. Joe recognized it. It was Katie's husband's car. Katie got out, followed by her children. Then her husband stepped out with large bags, and behind him appeared Ellen, talking and gesturing. They unloaded boxes, bags, and a lot of belongings from the trunk. Ellen pulled out a pair of shiny new keys from her pocket. She opened the front door, and the whole group disappeared inside. Joe stood there and watched. Her heart was pounding, and her hands were shaking with rage. Mark had given his mother a spare key again, and now they were moving Katie and her family into the apartment while Joe was supposedly away. She pulled out her phone and called her friend. Hey, Lena, can I stay at your place tonight? Sure, did something happen? I'll tell you in person. I'll be there in an hour. Joe got into her car and drove off. On the way to Lena's, she stopped at a store. She bought a bottle of wine and some chocolate. Her friend greeted her with a look of concern. How are you? You look pale. Fine, just tired. They sat down in the kitchen. Lena poured the wine. Joe told her everything about her mother-in-law, the attempted property transfer, the constant visits, and what she had seen at the entrance today. Lena listened and shook her head. This is a total breakdown. What are you going to do? I have a night shift tomorrow. I'll finish that, and then I'm going home in the morning. Joe looked her friend in the eye. And then we'll see who comes out on top. Lena was silent. Are you sure you can handle this? Absolutely. Do you want me to come along for support? That's not necessary. I'll do this alone. They finished the wine and went to bed. Joe hardly slept a wink. Her thoughts were racing, sharp as a knife. Her plan of action solidified in her mind. Tomorrow she would come home and find Katie there with her family. Ellen would probably be there too, and maybe Mark. And then, the real battle would begin. Joe was ready. The apartment documents were in the safe at work. Her phone was charged. The video recording app was installed, and the numbers for the police and her lawyer were saved for quick access. She knew exactly what she had to do, step by step, without emotion or hysteria, cold and calculating. Ellen had gone too far, and now it was time for a reckoning. In the morning, Joe got up early, had coffee with Lena, thanked her for the hospitality, and drove to her shift. She completed a very demanding 12-hour night shift. There were several difficult patients, including a suspected case of appendicitis that was confirmed, and the patient was moved to the operating room. By dawn, Joe could hardly stay on her feet, but she felt an absolute sense of clarity and calm. She changed her clothes, took her bag, grabbed the folder of documents from her locker, put it in her bag, got into her car, and drove home. On the way, she stopped at a supermarket. She bought a bag of groceries to maintain the appearance of normalcy. Bread, milk, eggs, vegetables. If anyone asked why she hadn't come straight home, she would say she was at the store. Though there probably wouldn't be anyone left to ask. Joe parked in front of the house, took the groceries in her bag, got out, went to the entrance, and opened the door with the security code. The elevator wasn't working, as usual at the most inconvenient moment. She had to climb to the 5th floor on foot. With every step, the tension inside her grew. Her heart beat steadily, her hands didn't shake, and her thoughts were clear. She knew what she would see up there, knew what she would say, and knew what she would do. She reached the 5th floor and paused. Right in front of her apartment door stood boxes and bags. Many were neatly stacked, wrapped in tape and string. Joe recognized her belongings. Clothes, shoes, books, cosmetics. Even framed photos were sitting on top of one of the boxes. They had locked her out. Jo slowly set the grocery bag on the floor, pulled her phone from her bag, and checked the full battery. She turned on the camera, set it to record video, pressed the red button, approached the door, put the key in the lock, and turned it. The lock clicked. The key worked, which meant they either didn't have time to change the lock or hadn't thought of it. Jo pushed the door open and stepped inside. The apartment smelled of fried onions and something sweet. Ellen was standing in the kitchen wearing a colorful apron, stirring a pot on the stove, her hair tucked under a scarf, the satisfied look of a lady of the house settling into her nest. Voices, children's laughter, footsteps, and the sound of furniture being moved drifted from the rooms. Katie said something to her husband, who replied in a deep voice. Ellen turned around when she heard footsteps, saw Jo standing in the doorway, and smiled broadly. "How nice of you to show up. Your things are already in the hallway. Take them, dear. My daughter and her husband are arriving soon. They have children, and they need the apartment more than you do." Jo slowly set her bag on the floor and didn't look away from Ellen. Ellen held a wooden spoon in her hand. She was smiling, expecting a reaction, expecting tears, screaming, or hysteria. She got none of that. After those words, there was no holding back. Jo raised her phone and pointed the camera at Ellen. Today is September 6th, 2025. It is 9:37 a.m. I, Joanna Bergman, am in my apartment at 53, Lark Lane, apartment 53. There are unauthorized persons in the apartment who refuse to leave. Ellen lowered the spoon. The smile vanished from her face. "What are you doing?" "I am documenting a crime." "What crime?" "This is my son's apartment." "No, this is my apartment. I am the sole owner." Jo walked down the hallway with the camera in her hand and looked into the living room. Katie and her husband were putting away children's things. Toys on the floor, clothes on the sofa, a stroller in the corner. The children, a boy and a girl, were sitting on the rug playing with building blocks. Documented. There are 4 people in the living room. Katie Ryder, her husband, and 2 minors who have entered the apartment without authorization and refused to leave. Katie jumped up from the sofa. "What are you doing?" "I'm recording a video to give to the police." "What police?" "Jo, are you crazy?" Jo ignored the question and went into the bedroom. Mark was there in sweatpants and a t-shirt, buried in his phone on the bed. When he saw his wife with the camera, he turned pale. Documented. Mark Ryder is in the bedroom. He is my husband, but he is not an owner of this property. Jo, let's talk calmly. No. She returned to the hallway. Ellen blocked her path. Her face was distorted with rage. Turn that off right now. You are not my mother-in-law. You are an unauthorized person illegally staying in my apartment. You have 10 minutes to leave the premises voluntarily. The clock is ticking. Ellen tried to snatch the phone from her hand. Jo backed away, holding the camera higher. Documented. Ellen Ryder is attempting to stop the recording and is using physical force. I'm not using force. I just want you to stop. The police are already on their way. You can pack your things. Ellen threw her hands over her head. Mark, are you going to let her throw your mother out onto the street? The confused husband came out of the bedroom with red blotches on his face. Jo, why are you doing this? Let's just talk. It's too late to talk. You broke into my apartment, threw my things out, and settled in here without my permission. This is a crime. What crime? I'm your husband. You are not the owner. You have no right to decide who lives here. Mark looked at his mother, then at his wife, opened his mouth, closed it again, and said nothing. Ellen stepped very close to Jo. Her eyes were burning, her voice trembling with anger. Do you realize what you're doing? You're putting a family with small children out on the street. You have an apartment, Ellen, and your daughter has a rental. Go there. You're heartless. Ellen Ryder raised her hand as if to strike. Jo didn't flinch. She just held the phone even higher, documenting a threat of physical violence by Ellen Ryder. Ellen lowered her hand, turned around, and went into the kitchen. She turned off the stove, took off her apron, and threw it on the table. We'll see how you sing when Mark demands a division of assets. Half of this apartment rightfully belongs to him. This apartment was bought before the marriage. Your son didn't contribute a single cent. I have all the paperwork, so any attempt is useless. We'll see about that. Ellen grabbed her bag and went into the hallway. Katie stood in the middle of the living room, hugging herself. Her husband gathered the children's things and stuffed them into bags. The children looked at the adults with frightened eyes. Mom, what do we do now? Katie asked with a trembling voice. We're leaving. Let this witch live here all by herself. They began packing their things. Joe stood in the hallway, filming everything. Mark stepped toward her and tried to take her hand. Stop this. It's madness. Let go of my hand. I didn't want it to end like this. It's just that Mom said, your mother decided she was in charge of my apartment, and you helped her. You threw me out like a piece of furniture, and now you're surprised I called the police? He backed away. I thought we could reach an agreement. Let Katie stay here temporarily. She'd find a better job, save up, and then move out. You thought that, but you didn't think it was necessary to ask me. You wouldn't have agreed. Exactly. Because this is my apartment, and only I decide who lives here. Ellen came out of the living room with a bag and a box, shooting Joe a look full of hatred. You'll regret this. You'll regret this day. Maybe, but not today. The doorbell rang. Joe opened it. On the threshold stood the local police officer, a man in his 40s in uniform with a tired face. Behind him stood a younger officer. Good afternoon. We received a call. Yes, please come in. Joe let them into the apartment. The officer looked around the hallway, noticing the people with their belongings and the children. What's the problem? Joe pulled a folder with documents from her bag. I am the owner of this apartment. Here is the property deed and the purchase agreement. These people entered without my permission, moved my things into the hallway, and refused to leave. The officer took the documents and checked them. You are the sole owner? Yes. And these people? Who are they? My mother-in-law, her daughter, and her family, and my husband. The policeman looked at Ellen. Do you have any documents confirming your right to live here? Ellen straightened up. What documents? This is my son's apartment. Does your son have ownership rights? No, but he's my husband. He lives here. The officer turned to Mark. Is this your registered address? Yes. Are you the owner or a co-owner? No. Then you have no right to stay here against the owner's will. Ellen gasped. Excuse me? He's my husband. That doesn't give him an automatic right to the apartment if it's in his wife's name and was purchased before the marriage. The officer handed the documents back to Joe. Everything's in order. You have the right to ask these people to leave. Folks, pack your things and leave voluntarily. Otherwise, we'll have to file a report for criminal trespassing. Ellen clutched her chest and sank onto the table. I feel sick. Unmoved, the officer pulled out his radio. Call an ambulance. Ellen quickly jumped up. That's not necessary. I'm fine. Katie took the children by the hand. Her husband picked up the boxes. They went into the hallway and down the stairs. Ellen followed them, shooting Joe a look full of hatred. The mother-in-law was horrified by what Joe had done. She hadn't expected her quiet, exhausted daughter-in-law to be capable of this, calling the police on her husband's family and throwing them all out without hesitation. Mark stood in the hallway. The officer looked at him. Are you leaving too? Mark looked at his wife. Leave, Mark. Take your things and go to your mother's. You can't do this. I'm your husband. There's nothing left to talk about. But there is. We need to talk about everything. No, there isn't. You chose your mother. Go live with her. The officer coughed. Sir, I advise you to comply. Your wife has every right to ask you to leave. Mark stood there for another minute, then turned and went into the bedroom. He came back with a bag he'd hastily stuffed with clothes. He walked past Joe without looking at her. The door closed. The officer looked at Joe. You'll need to file a report. Yes, I want to press charges for criminal trespassing. All right, we'll do that at the station. You can come in later today. I'll come after I've had some rest. Understood. Here's my card. Call when you're ready to come in. The police left. Joe locked the door with every bolt and leaned against it. Silence. For the first time in hours, there was absolute silence. She walked through the apartment. In the kitchen, the half-finished soup in the pot had gone cold. On the table were vegetable scraps and dirty knives. In the living room, toys were scattered about. The sofa cushion was crumpled. In the bedroom, the bed was a mess. Mark's clothes were on the floor. Joe sat down on the floor in the middle of the hallway. The phone was still filming. She turned off the camera, set the phone aside, and buried her face in her hands. She didn't cry. She just sat there. Then she got up, went into the bathroom, turned on the shower, undressed, and stood under the hot water. The water washed away the fatigue, the tension, and the anger. Joe stood under the shower for about 20 minutes until her skin was flushed from the heat. She stepped out, dried off, put on comfortable clothes, and went back to the hallway to get her things from the landing. She carried the boxes and bags into the apartment and set them in the corners. She didn't unpack. She didn't have the strength. She lay down in bed and fell asleep instantly. She woke up in the afternoon. Outside, it was already getting dark. She got up, went to the kitchen, threw away the leftover soup, washed the pot, wiped the table, took out the trash, and turned on the kettle. The phone rang incessantly with calls and messages. Mark sent long, angry texts about how heartless she was. Ellen sent voice notes threatening a lawsuit. Katie accused her of making the children homeless. Jo blocked all 3 numbers. Then she called her lawyer and told her what had happened. The lawyer snorted in approval. "You did the right thing. File for divorce now, and don't let them back in under any circumstances, even if they beg." "I won't." "Perfect. Come by tomorrow, and we'll get the paperwork ready." Jo thanked her and hung up. She drank tea with cookies and looked out the window. The city went on with its life. Lights in the windows, street lamps along the roads, a few cars passing by a normal night on an ordinary day. But her life had changed completely. The next day, Jo went to the police station and filed a report for criminal trespassing. Then she filed for divorce with her lawyer. A week later, she received the court summons. Mark tried calling from unknown numbers, begging for a meeting and a chance to talk, promising it would never happen again. Jo replied briefly. Divorce was inevitable. Ellen lurked outside the house. Jo called the police. The officer spoke with her, after which the mother-in-law didn't show up again. Katie wrote angry posts on social media about the cruel sister-in-law who had thrown a family with children out onto the street. Some people Jo knew read them and unfollowed her, while others offered their support. 2 months passed. The divorce was processed quickly. Mark didn't resist, realizing it was pointless. The apartment remained Jo's property. Her ex-husband moved in with his mother and found a new job. Every now and then, Jo heard from mutual friends that he was complaining about his ex-wife, calling her heartless and calculating. Let him talk, she thought. Katie and her family finally moved out of their old apartment. They found a cheaper place on the outskirts of town. Ellen Ryder helped them out financially and looked after the kids. The family went on with their lives. Some acquaintances actually turned their backs on Jo. They believed she'd been cruel, and that she should have given in to help her relatives. Jo didn't bother justifying herself. She simply cut those people out of her life. Her true friends stayed. Lena supported her from day one and helped her get through the divorce. Her colleagues at work were understanding too. They knew Jo as a responsible, honest person. Life eventually stabilized. Work, home, the occasional get-together with friends. It was quiet, steady, peaceful, and lonely. One Friday evening, Jo came home after another shift. She unlocked the door with her key, a key she knew no one could copy without her permission, and stepped into the apartment. Silence, cleanliness, and order. She took off her jacket and hung it up. She kicked off her shoes. In the kitchen, she turned on the kettle, grabbed a mug and a tea bag, poured the water, and sat by the window. Outside, the city was settling into the evening. Lights glowed in the windows of nearby houses, street lamps lined the roads, and only a few cars passed by. It was a cold November with an overcast sky. Winter would be here soon. Jo sipped her tea slowly. She was exhausted and sleepy, but she didn't want to get up and go to the bedroom just yet. It felt good just to sit there, alone in the silence. Sometimes the thoughts crept in. What if she'd been wrong? What if it would have been better to try and reach an agreement, or find a compromise? Maybe she really should have let Katie stay for a few months to help her out. But then, Jo remembered that day. She remembered the boxes of her things piled in the hallway, and Ellen Ryder in the kitchen, acting like she owned the place. She remembered Mark Ryder, who didn't even try to stand up for his wife. In an instant, the doubts vanished. She had done the right thing. She'd paid a high price for it: loneliness, the judgment of others, and a ruined marriage. She lost her husband, though to be honest, she'd lost him much earlier the moment he chose his mother over his wife. But she kept the things that mattered most: her home, her dignity, and her freedom. Jo finished her tea, put the mug in the sink, and turned off the kitchen light. She went to the bedroom, climbed into bed, pulled up the covers, and closed her eyes. Tomorrow would be a new day, a new shift, new patience, and new tasks. Life moved forward, even if she was alone, even if some people thought she was heartless, and even if sadness occasionally washed over her in the evenings. This was her choice, and she didn't regret a thing. Sometimes, you have to lose people to keep yourself. Did you enjoy this story? What city are you listening from? Let me know in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep creating more content like this. Thank you so much for your incredible support. I'm looking forward to reading your thoughts on the story. You'll see 2 more life stories on the screen now that I highly recommend. There's plenty more to explore on the channel, so don't forget to subscribe.